Hi students, so this is the point in time where you are ready to submit your Theory of Knowledge exhibition. Prior to this, you have obviously worked in unpacking the prompt, selecting objects, establishing the link, and then clearly explaining that link before justifying the inclusion of your object for the exhibition overall. Before you submit, it's important to take a couple of key notes from the IB subject reports. This is the latest one that I'll be unpacking and identifying what key strategies that you can implement prior to your submission. Before you submit, it's really important that you go through and check your work against the criteria. This has remained unchanged in the guide. The key driving question of the TOK exhibition is how students demonstrate and show how TOK manifests in the world around us. High scoring students for this particular task are going to demonstrate this clearly, effectively, and in an insightful way. The four key elements in relation to the criteria you need to think about is the object, the link, the justification, and the reasoning. Your objects need to be specific and they need to be centered around the real world context that you've established. The link is the most integral part of the exhibition overall. You need to make sure that that link has been established and you've clearly explained what that link means. You've then backed up that link and that explanation with reasoning. You may use reasoning from the object and evidence and examples from the object or outside references to academic or the IA prompt. And then finally, you've justified the distinct contribution that the object makes to the exhibition overall, ensuring that your justifications do not overlap between the three objects. The May 25 subject report outlines a lot of the similar kind of feedback you've been receiving probably throughout your TOK exhibition journey. You do not need a general introduction or a conclusion. It was identified in the subject report that some students were over the 950 word count. Some students were definitely under the word count as well. You need to make use of the 950 words. I'll explain at the end, what is part of that word count and what is not. So you need to make sure that you use full use of that word count. This task cannot be done well with a 250 word commentary. It's important to note as well that there is no requirement for the following elements, and these are common misnomers or mistakes when it comes to the exhibitions. You do not need personal objects. You do not need to identify objects and how they are personal to you. You may select these as you identify the knowledge and it's maybe more clearly easy for you to able to identify that knowledge, but there's no need to talk about the personal nature of the object. It may help you in exploring the prompt, but if it's not relevant for the discussion of the prompt, there is no need to do so. You also, unlike the essay, do not require any references to the areas of knowledge. There is no specific requirement for you to integrate the TOK concepts, and you do not need to include philosophical theories. The IB states that this dampens creativity and deprives you, the student, of the opportunity to think about the world around you and your way of thinking about that. So make sure that you do not if you have been told that this is a requirement, you need to reconsider your exhibition. Make sure before you submit that you anonymize your work. It should not have your name, school logos, or any other identifiable information. The same can be true for your objects. If they have identifying, you should try and blur those out where possible. You should need to make sure that your commentary has the prompt at the very top of the page. You should be really clearly identifying that. Objects. The best exhibitions have the most interesting and insightful objects. They need to be specific and context needs to be made relevant to the exploration of the prompt. Contextualizing the object and identifying what knowledge it manifests is the transition to establishing the link that you're trying to make between the object and the prompt. So that contextualizing element is really important and it should lead nicely into your link. The IB states, as a part of the May 25 subject report, that the best objects were adventuresome and insightful. So if you've chosen a well-trodden path or one which leads to a very mundane or superficial understanding, then perhaps you need to reconsider that. The same can be said for objects which are continue to be repeated time and time again. You should try to look for objects that you find interesting and that are interesting for discussion. You need to make sure that you select objects where the knowledge that is manifested is really apparent. If you choose really complex objects where it's very difficult for you to identify the knowledge, you're going to spend a lot of words establishing the context or describing what the knowledge is as a part of the object. You need to choose objects where it should be clear to the marker what knowledge it manifests from even before you start explaining it, from simply just looking at the object. And remember that the object is the focal point of the discussion. So weaker responses, the IB states, made no mention of the object after identifying it and looked at more kind of general unrelated ideas. The object is the framework from which you're going to explore the prompt. So it needs to be linked back to and tracked throughout your discussion. Generic objects are still continue to be used. iPhones, cars, sneakers. These are just simply taken from the internet or just simply taken a photo of. It's also important that you don't try and make them non-generic by just putting my in front of them. This does not make them a generic object specific because they still go on to treat it generically in your commentary. You should also avoid objects which are symbolic of knowledge. So examples of this could be a crucifix to represent religious beliefs or glasses to represent different perspectives. These objects themselves don't manifest that knowledge. So you need to be really clear about the objects of which you're talking about. Repetition of objects, a lot of students, continue to just walk well-trodden paths for objects. Rosetta Stone, Rubik's Cube, graphics calculator, or selecting these from a website. Okay, this leads to it being unsophisticated or inauthentic analysis. Successful exhibitions. This is to summarize this whole point about objects. Successful exhibitions showed how students were thinking of the task as truly an exhibition of artifacts with an appreciation of the special, unique, and specific nature of a particular object that revealed some aspect of the knowledge we have for our world. So you need to have that at the forefront of your mind. It should be an exhibition. They should be able to be put into a museum. They should be special, unique, and specific to talking about it. And it should focus on knowledge, not simply describing or repeating what the object is. The prompt. If the object is the heart of your exhibition, the prompt has got to be the overall focus. It's the lens from which we view the objects. If you don't have a clear lens, you're going to get a blurry picture. Okay, and that's what we see time and time again with people's exhibitions. So you need to make sure, okay, that you have a really clear understanding of that prompt, okay, and address it in its entirety. There are a number of examples, okay, with prompts that have been misunderstood. If you're doing these prompts, or any prompt, it's really important that you consider the different aspects of that. And I'll show you in a second about how you can do that. The conceptual links between different keywords need to be understood. And you need to understand how they connect and how they to your chosen objects. Okay, this will form the basis for your exhibition. Each prompt is created in the exact same way. They are all about knowledge. They all invite some sort of contest or controversy, and they all draw on TOK concepts. What we mean by this is that they go beyond about a specific object and they engage with general issues about the context surrounding each object. So it's important that you use the object as a starting point for discussing knowledge and then relate it back to the object in some way, making sure you don't lose focus on the object throughout your exploration. And making sure as well that you're discussing knowledge and not simply just describing what the object shows. Contestability refers to its ability to engage and deepen your explanation of issues. You should be trying to identify as a part of your explanation the dynamic or tension or controversy which is hinted at by the prompt. There are some examples of how you can do that with regards to different prompts here. So if you're doing the prompt, what counts as good justification, you might, consider the dilemma about how different communities justify their claims And how do we know whether the claims are correct or not? Or whose justification may be better? The role of experts is a very common prompt, and it alludes to issues about the role of trust and power and the impact of status quo on the construction of knowledge. It's important that you consider these dilemmas. They are implicitly embedded into the prompt and will require you to pose questions about the prompt in order to kind of draw them out. It's important, though, that when you're doing that, you do not need to phrase this explanation as a rhetorical question. Focus on the prompt and how these different dilemmas, issues, controversies are embedded as a part of that discussion. The last point, okay, is that they draw on TOK concepts. Importantly, this doesn't mean that you need to force inclusion of the TOK concepts into your discussion, but make them pertinent or applied as a part of your discussion. The TOK concepts can be a useful tool in helping you to explain knowledge, but simply just name dropping them and identifying them throughout your work does not sufficiently count as integration of the TOK concepts. And importantly, you need to come to a conceptual understanding of what that term means. Okay, what does, if we're thinking about the concept of bias, okay, we need to be thinking about, okay, well, is bias good or is it bad? We need to be thinking about where does bias come from? We need to be thinking about how bias shapes different perspectives. How can it be avoided, overcome, circumnavigated? So by a discussion of the concept of bias, I've now drawn out all these different aspects. So it can help me to structure my kind of TOK kind of thinking. Themes are not required. You do not need to have a theme. The IB recommends them because it can help you when thinking about different objects. It can help you to thinking about related objects and thinking about it in relation to the prompt. Think of the theme as sort of barriers to help guide your exploration. And remember that the focus needs to be on the prompt rather than the theme. You don't even need to explicitly mention the theme. Think of the theme as the kind of guardrails for your exhibition, and I want to view it through these different aspects. What ends up happening, though, to be avoided when you do select a theme is being repetitive with your kind of same points. So you need to make sure that even though you have a theme, that you're connecting it to the different aspects and issues. The real-world context, and importantly, the real-world knowledge context. You need to be explicit in that contextualizing element what knowledge is manifested by the object. Use those words, okay? It is part of the driving question of TOK. What knowledge is manifested by this object? That should be the first thing you're trying to do, and there's a part of that contextualizing element. You should really try to avoid describing objects, okay? Students tend to describe objects that are, really complex or they're unclear what knowledge it is, so that needs to be kind of apparent. Don't make the task more difficult for yourself. If you do describe it, it tends to lead to not very meaningful discussion or development, and it's often just a lot of anecdotal, your own personal opinion, your own personal view. That's unsupported. The link is the critical part of a highly awarding exhibition. It is integral to the success. If you're on the weaker side, you're going to struggle to make connections to the link, okay, or they only become apparent at the end of the commentary. Weaker responses tend to have a lot of description, and then through the process of describing and maybe a little bit of explanation, they eventually, by the end of it, come to the link. What students need to do is you need to remove all that description, okay, and put your link at the forefront of your exhibition. So after you contextualize your object, identifying what knowledge that it manifests, that should lead nicely into establishing that particular link. Okay, and use the terminology, the link between the object and the prompt is, or the object and the prompt are linked in. Use the terminology, and that will help the markers to identify where your link is. Weaker responses, okay, tend to forget that link and go off to different tangential points or hypothetical scenarios, okay, that are given as evidence. So make sure that you use the terms from the prompt or paraphrase them in a way that you make sure that you're addressing the prompt throughout your exhibition. You should not lose focus on this. Your explanation. If you have a clear link, your explanation will also most likely be clear. So if you're doing this well, you are answering how and why. Simply identifying is not explanation. Okay, so if you're just making statements, okay, then that is not considered explanation. Pointing, naming, not explaining. You need to focus on how and why. What students also tend to do is they talk about when they're good at identifying a TOK issue, but then they don't then push themselves further to explore it. So think about the prompt, what role do experts play? They might suggest that experts do have a role, but what is that role? How do they shape us? How do they influence us? How do they guide us? How might they limit us? How might they gatekeep knowledge? Okay, you need to explain that role in a particular way. Or what they do is students tend to stop at the most obvious point, that experts do influence our knowledge. Okay, you need to start posing more kind of critical analytical questions of yourself. Is it right that they have an influence? When is it right for them to have that influence? Okay, you need to thinking about when and at what time, and what is the power that is entrusted on those experts. This is the same for any single prompt. And lastly, the justification. You need to make sure this is really explicitly identified. Why have you included this object? What makes this object distinct? You should try and zoom out a little bit with your justification. Why have I included this particular object? Why does it offer an interesting insight? It may not necessarily be unique, but why does it offer an interesting insight into the prompt as a whole? So your link is the what, your justification is the why you've included it. Lastly, this is just a reminder of the kind of keys to success that we've talked about. Description should be at a minimum. You should look to provide specific context. Avoid making connections to fictional, hypothetical, symbolic knowledge. Making sure that you're engaging in the driving question. Making sure that you're focusing on the prompt in its entirety. You need to make certain that your link connects features of the object with the keywords from the prompt. Okay, if you are struggling to deepen your explanation, try to go back and consider the dynamic or the tension or the controversy hinted at in the title. And you might need to do that by looking at the implicit elements of that particular prompt. They provide some ideas for what you can do. Lastly, formatting. Make sure it is size 12, New Roman, 1.5 spacing. Make sure your work is anonymous. Okay, it's important to name it as such. Okay, and make sure that you do not go over the 950 word count. Okay, this does not include any text on or within the object. So if you are using a page, okay, the text on that page does not count towards that. Acknowledgement, references, or a bibliography do also not count. If you have a caption for your object, that does count. We recommend that because it helps you identify what the object is really clearly, and then you can make your first sentence being the object manifests this particular knowledge. So you can get straight into the contextualization and you don't have to identify what the object is. You don't need to do both. So I hope that clarifies how to approach the final improvements you can make for your TOK exhibition. I wish you all the best, and we look forward to receiving your work.